So we'll go ahead and continue forward. As per usual, I'm going to do a quick review. We are talking about the Doctrine of Man. Wade used the fancy word anthropology, which is another way of saying like the nature of man, doctrine of man, or like one's nature. We started off this series discussing Augustinian original sin, where this idea that you carry Adam's guilt comes from. And I, of course, when I don't think that's the best way to describe it, then I read church fathers that said the exact opposite of what Augustine said, that came before Augustine, and they actually said that people who taught what he taught were actually false teachers, which is strong words. Like, whoa, all right. And which is funny because so many of us, again, consider that to be normal. Then last week we went through Genesis a little bit, discussing the nature of the tree and the way basically that they gave us knowledge of good and evil, which gives us conflicting desires in our flesh. And then also we discussed the Immaculate Conception of Mary, because they believe that we got to get around this idea of inherited guilt somehow. So what they say is that Mary inherited a certain amount of grace, that she was born without sin, so that way she could give birth to a sinless Savior. That's where that idea of the Immaculate Conception of Mary comes from. Again, for those who are not here, the Immaculate Conception of Mary is not saying that Jesus was born sinless. They're saying that Mary was born sinless. Okay? So, and of course, that begs the question, why couldn't God just give everyone that special grace and make everyone born without the guilt of Adam? You know what I'm saying? So it brings some of those problems to light more and more. So my proposal is that the idea of Augustine's particular brand of original sin is wrong, but that there is and now just so you guys know, there's like 5 different views of original sin and within Orthodox Christianity. Okay, I'm not talking about the progressive crazies. So because there's some really wacky views out there, but what I'm proposing is basically the Jewish view, the early church view, even very in line with the Orthodox church view, and I just think it answers the question. However, even if you disagree, perhaps you can use an opposing view. Remember we talked about apologetics, how sometimes it's about just having a tool in your toolbox? Mm-hmm. So even if you're like, I don't agree with you, but I can at least give you an answer from a different perspective that could help get over that objection you may or may not have. Actually, I was talking to Jordan a couple weeks ago about my friend Braxton. He's the president of my seminary. And we were talking, I was like, well, because you're saying, well, he says he believes this, or we were trying to figure out what he believes. Because here's the thing with Braxton. He's an evangelist and an apologist at heart. So whenever an objection comes up, he will sidestep and shift and give a defense from a different position that he might not actually hold. But he never says he does or does not hold to it. He just goes, well, there's also this view in Christianity that's X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. And you just go, okay, but what do you believe? Sometimes it's either a good thing or a bad thing, depending who you ask. For me, I found it very beneficial because it showed me that I didn't always have to just defend my view. I could defend other people's views, and that helps. So, make sense?
Well, you challenge people to make up their mind.
Right, or at least dig a little deeper, right? Like, dig a little deeper on that. It might not be only the way you've been taught. There might be other ways, and to understand this, it doesn't make you a heretic, right? Mostly. There are heretical beliefs, but we're not going to talk about that right now. So, last week we discussed the idea of the yetzers, which is the Hebrew word for desire. And yetzer hara is the evil desire, and the yetzer hatov, which is the good desire. Every person is born with these desires because you have the flesh. The flesh has knowledge of good and evil now, therefore it has conflicting desires, which is why we see children do good things out of their own will and bad things out of their own will. So we see unbelievers do good of their own will, because they have that, because we are made in the image of God. If we say sin fully corrupted mankind all the way down to his nature, like the Westminster Confession and other confessions say, then we're essentially saying that that the image of God was fully corrupted in man. And I think that's a problem. Does that make sense? So we have to be careful the way we're wording some of those things, because and I don't have time to go back and read all those, but if you guys want the quotes, I can give it to you. I can even send you my notes at the end of the series. So, but remember, we have this idea as well that sin is something that you cannot control, right? You're born with it, therefore you can't control it. It is what it is, which is why Jesus Christ needed to die for you, all that. And now I'm not saying that Jesus Christ didn't need to die for you, and I'm not saying that sin is going to be easily avoidable. But I do say that God told Cain in Genesis chapter 4 that sin is crouching at the door. Its desires for you, but you must what? Rule over it. So in other words, there is victory that can be taking place. So anyway, with that being said, remember the idea of all of this came from the idea of Augustine, who misunderstood the word concupiscence in his Latin Vulgate. The word, how many of you guys, if I ask you what concupiscence means, knows what it means?
Nope.
I know it's a bad thing.
It sounds bad.
It sounds negative, but I don't know.
The Bible said all manner of evil concupiscence. I would like that.
So yeah, concupiscence is, so what happened was Augustine, he could not read Greek or Hebrew. He could only read the Latin. And when I say the word consequence, do you get a positive or negative impression in your mind? Negative, right? However, I could say I got absolutely ripped as a consequence of eating right and working out. Is it necessarily always negative? No, but it generally has a negative connotation, right? In Latin, concupiscence was the same way, and it was the word that they used for desire. So when Augustine is reading this in his Latin Vulgate, and he's reading all the stuff about desires, he associated desire equals bad. Okay? Now here's the thing. Do you think that all your desires are bad?
No.
No. Well, and to him, that's all the desires of the flesh. And he just, you can understand where the language thing can break down and context can break down and why he makes wrong conclusions. So he made this idea that, oh my goodness, desire must be all bad. And therefore, it's all desires of the flesh. It's all concupiscence. Concupiscence, just so you guys know, you might notice it has the same pretext as concubine. It is a longing of the flesh, a desire of the flesh is kind of what it would be, which is why concubine, prostitute, desire of the flesh, you kind of get the idea. So what ends up happening is that this causes problems, though, because in the New Testament, the Greek word for desire is epithumia. Epithumia means longing or desire, and in Luke 22:15, Jesus says, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Well, if desires are sinful, we're making Jesus sinful. So you see the problem on this, which is why, again, Augustine, for all, he has a great defense of the Trinity. There's a lot of good things he did. No, Jordan's like, there's a lot of good things that Augustine had accomplished, but I will say, generally speaking, I think Augustine's majorly overrated and has impacted the church more negatively. But that's neither here nor there right now.
Did you talk about the sarx?
Huh?
Did you talk about the sarx, the flesh, having that evil? Did you talk about the desires of the flesh?
Yes.
Okay.
The Greek word for flesh.
The sarx. Paul uses sarx and he uses the flesh. He usually uses it with a negative connotation.
Right, but not always. So it's
Not
like,
always.
which is why, because again, the flesh is what's corrupted with sin, right? That's where your evil desire comes from. But that's not necessarily what is the. It's not saying necessarily that all flesh is evil because God created flesh, right? So we got to be careful before we say all flesh is evil. But when he talks about like the sinful nature or take on the likeness of sinful flesh, he's talking about the corrupted nature that became with a corrupted world of sin. Like sin is like, I like to look at, actually I use this analogy, maybe this will help. We look at sin probably like a cancer. It's something that is attached to us, and so we're like the patient, right? Oh, we have sin, we're corrupted, it grows within, and it causes problems, and we kind of constantly have to surgically remove it, go through spiritual treatments to cleanse, so to speak. But then God looks at cancer kind of like a doctor, right? I mean, he looks at sin like a doctor. He's outside of it, but he's trying to treat it. And so, but just because you have cancer within you, does that mean your entire body's cancerous? No. Doesn't mean your entire being's corrupted. It means that there's something corrupted within this other part that's attached to you, Brandon.
So would you say like partially depraved?
No.
Well,
Brandon?
and we have to remember,
Get out.
if you go back to the Greek culture, the Greeks considered that flesh thing, that was not a good thing anyway. They considered the flesh was a lower form of the other world, the other life.
You're not wrong, which is kind of might explain why Gnosticism took off too,
Oh, yeah.
right? That all physical is evil.
Yeah.
And then you continue on later on, and you also get this idea that all flesh is corrupted and all bad. It's funny how that little thread is weaved throughout history. So, and I think it's incorrect. So anyway, desires cannot be fully evil again from Adam through original sin. Otherwise, again, Jesus had evil desires then, and we just proved that Jesus did not. Remember before, because in all those passages said that he was without sin, but it still says he was like us in every respect. So this causes some serious issues. I know some of this is review, but I think it's important because we have some people in here who weren't there for that. If he was like us in every respect, well then he couldn't have been born with sin. He couldn't have been born with guilt, which causes a problem. Then he's not like us at all, really, if he doesn't. So really what it is, it makes more sense that he was born in the flesh, same as us, and that flesh is where we get those contrary desires. Does that make a bit more sense? One, it keeps Jesus perfect, and also it doesn't create a weird metaphysical contradiction that you don't need to get to the same place that we all are sinners. Okay? So, if desire in the Bible can be both good and bad, that helps us understand where Augustine went wrong. He couldn't read Greek and Hebrew. He only relied on the Latin. And so it really kind of caused some of that problem. So all God-given desires, because God does give desires, he gives appetites and he gives longings, to Augustine and the church throughout, these desires, these God-given desires, took on a sinister perspective through this translated word and altered Augustine's understanding of human nature. So when you really think about that, you go, oh, that's a problem, right? I don't, not all your desires are bad. Do we all desire love? Yes. Is that bad? No. But Augustine said would say that's selfishness. When really we're commanded to love, right? That's something that's part of human nature, being created in God's image. So his conclusion, as we stated last week, which is original sin as concupiscence, which he considers a base and sexual desire, and sin was really a sexually transmitted condition, which is very strange, which is why he thinks that mankind had to be born. Jesus had to be born of a virgin. Of course, the Bible doesn't say that. It just says it'll be a sign unto you, and probably a sign that he is the Father, right? So, as such, all men are born with their will, mind, and body corrupt, and thus deserving of God's wrath. That's his view. But that's not the picture that we really see painted. We see that if you are in your sin, you are worthy of God. Then God will pour out his sin on his wrath on your unrighteousness. But what we also see that God loves you, right? And that you're worthy of something at least to be saved, right? You're valuable. That's one of the arguments for God's existence, right? The argument for meaning. Without God, there is no meaning to the universe. It's all an accident. Well, if your life has meaning, then your life has value, right? If your life has meaning, it has value. So of course, those things have to. We can't hold two contradictory views and just call it mystery. We just got to say that maybe we got to adjust some sort of understanding a little bit. All right, anyway, abortion in children. Let's talk about this as far as original sin. So, how many of you guys have ever wondered what in the world happens to babies when they die? It's a good question that many people have asked, right? That's a good question, especially with all the problems of human nature. So this idea of infant damnation, the belief that God sends infants and young children to hell, is actually logical depending on your upbringing, right? So man is created with Adam's sin nature and his guilt. Without faith in Christ and regeneration and baptism, all go to hell. Man's life begins at conception. Man possesses the sin nature and the guilt the moment he exists. Therefore, aborted babies and miscarried babies would go to hell. Well, that's a little depressing, right? And this also goes against the Christian message, which is don't abort. We did a whole abortion series this last summer. Don't commit abortion. Why? Because what do we say? They're innocent. Well, if you're born guilty of Adam's sin, you're anything but innocent. Does that make sense? You're not innocent at all. You're guilty. So causes, again, more problems. Everyone deserves hell from the point of existence on this view. We all were in Adam, in his gametes, and deserving of hell. The early church tried to reconcile the understanding that babies were innocent, yet they still keep Adam's guilt. Some of the people after this were saying that. But their conclusion, which is that there must be a limbo of infants. This was developed in the 1300s. Like, so a mediary state between heaven and hell. So they go to limbo. In October of 2003, the Pope commissioned a study on the idea of limbo for infants. They concluded that original sin is a thing, damnation is deserved by babies, but it is possible that children are saved by a special work of God.
Can you say that slower?
Oh, yeah. In October 2003, the Pope commissioned a study on the idea of limbo for infants, and they concluded at the end of their study that original sin, in Augustine's view, right, inherited sin, nature, and guilt, is a thing, so it's real. Damnation is deserved by infants, but it is possible that children are saved by a special work of God. Whew. Yeah. Tell me you're not depressed already hearing this.
Doesn't give much comfort for mothers.
No, like, oh, your child, you had a miscarriage? Well, guess what? You know, like, that's real. And it should tell you something, too. If mankind is more merciful than God, that's questionable at best, right? So, how many have, and here's the thing, how many of you guys have ever held a newborn infant? Some of you guys might be parents, right? Right? Okay. Does that creature look like it is deserving of any punishment, let alone hell? No. So such a teaching is insane, asinine, really, right? It's insanity. And so a sinner and they also would say that it's a sinner that if they died there in the hospital would have no place to go but hell, or require a special saving work by Jesus. And where do we find any of that in the Bible?
Not there.
No.
David's reference to going to be with his child, but that's all.
Right, but that's the Sheol, which is like the place of the dead.
It's called federal headship.
Right, this idea that one person sinned as the federal head of the entire race, right? And that impacts the rest of the entire race.
You get that from Hebrews, right? That for in one man's sin, so death passed to.
Yep. That Romans 5:12.
Oh, okay.
Yep. Hebrews and Romans, they both kind of deal with some of those concepts, but Romans 5:12 is the one. John Calvin believed infants who die could be part of the elect and saved by God in some other way, but not done necessarily for all. So.
Yeah, so that's where the covenant theology comes from.
They were predestined.
That if a parent is in the covenant and their child dies, then they'll go to heaven.
Yeah.
Either one's
So-
wrong.
So they receive a special grace as believers.
Yeah.
Well, Jonathan Edwards taught that it was all predetermined whether they go, which ones go where God sorted them out.
Right, God elects some and
Some
he
elect
damns
some.
others. And again, aren't you all glad he came to church
That
today?
seems kind of partial.
He does.
Doesn't God not show partiality?
Yeah, I agree with you. Trust me, I agree with you. It's just that's why I say all the time, like, how is this not God showing partiality to one degree or other? So Luther said, and I quote, "All infants who die are saved through the merit of faith possessed by their parents." Again, where is that in the Bible? And this is the idea of infant baptism, what you might call pedobaptism. Now, not necessarily all, because some believe that's an entry into a covenant, so I don't want to strawman everyone who does pedobaptism, but the large belief, like in the Catholic Church, they believe that they had to wash away the stain of original sin through baptism to allow the possibility for regeneration. My friend's church growing up believed that baptizing a child baptized them into the church, into the community of believers, with an assumption through this baptism that the child was predestined for salvation. My friend was raised in the Reformed Church, okay? So if we think the guilty deserve God's wrath, and we are born guilty, and more sinful creatures damned to hell are created every time a new baby is conceived, how can any Christian be against abortion? Because wouldn't that just be like, well, we're just getting ahead of it, right? We're just condemning the guilty already, right? Again, I'm not saying we believe this, but I'm just trying to ask you guys those tough questions, all right? So I'm not trying to be mean. I'm literally trying to ask you, make you uncomfortable, make you go, maybe I do have a wrong understanding. Maybe you don't. Maybe you already have this figured out, but Cal.
Or how was God just in punishing Israel for sacrificing their kids to Molech or eating their children?
Right. It just turns into...
Right, if they're evil and are going to go to hell anyways, what does it matter what we do to them?
Yeah, you don't want to go down that road.
Yeah.
That's basically,
You don't
I
wanna-
mean-
you don't want to fish in that pond.
Well, and I heard it reminds me of when I was in high school. I was in a computer class, and there was a girl next to me, and we were out at the computer, and she was like, it was a homeschool Christian like co-op thing,
Yeah.
and she is like, and I just was like, oh, so what are you doing later on today? Just making conversation. She said, oh, I'm gonna meet my boyfriend at blah blah blah. I was like, huh, and I was like, we're like 15, and homeschooling, dating is taboo,
Yep.
and so I was like, your parents let you date? Weird. If you're from public schools, don't judge. Okay, all right. Like,
I've been dating all 18, so.
in the homeschool world, that's edgy. All right. and she goes, well, no, not really. But the Bible says we're born sinners, so we may as well just sin anyway.
Ah.
And when she said that, I was like,
Oh.
I didn't really know what to say because at the time I believed in Augustinian original sin, and I was kind of like, I mean, I feel like that logic isn't right, but I don't really know what to say to that. That was like
Yeah.
14, 15.
Should we continue sinning that grace may increase?
Yeah. So like grace may abound. Woo. So, the other question is why would God ask us to, fill and subdue the earth like he told Adam and Eve, like he told Noah? Why would he say that children are a blessing? Because really it would be that children are evil. You're creating more miscreants. And wouldn't the greatest act of mercy be one to not to bring a child into this world that will have the possibility of going to hell right from the get-go? If they don't survive long enough for them to be baptized or to come to Christ on their own or whatever, they're just doomed anyway. So wouldn't it be more responsible not to have children? I mean, I know this is, these are the questions that make you go, huh. And as a huge pro-life advocate, that was actually what I was feeling like I didn't quite understand this properly. A couple years ago, I found, I dug into this, and it was actually a lot of those questions that made me go, okay, I need to look into this more clearly, more deeply.
God adopts all his children.
So, all right. Now, guys, open up your Bibles. What's our time? Oh, good. Yeah. We're doing okay. And while you guys are doing that, turn to Genesis chapter 6.
I'm going to back you up a little bit here. Have you discussed the possibility that sin comes from the father? Did you talk about that theory?
Inherited guilt from the father?
Yeah.
The
I
sins
did.
of the father upon the generation.
Yeah,
that verse?
Ezekiel chapter 18.
So Jesus was without sin because he didn't have a earthly father.
Well, that's where that idea comes from, but I
You
disagree.
didn't talk about that though.
Not yet.
Okay.
Not fully. I
You did
discussed
in
it
a
in the
different
past.
class, a little
Yeah,
bit.
I've done it. Yeah.
Okay.
Let's see. Hold on. There's a thing.
Didn't you basically reference that with like sin being an STD, basically?
Yeah.
Genesis 6, you said?
Yes.
An STD that only affects men. Only comes from men.
Kyle, you just called me out.
Right. That's right. Perfect.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. Cool. All right. So, Genesis chapter 6. So, my proposal is that children are not born with sin. They're born with conflicting desires that lead to sin. So, because it says, from the days of their youth, their hearts are turned toward evil. And that word youth, was it Namur, is I believe what it is? Neur, which is also the same word used to describe the age of David, the age of Mary. It's used to describe parents, and it's also used to describe prostitutes. So, from the days of their younghood, essentially, like when you're teenagers, essentially, it would be more, which is why they said at your bar mitzvah or the bat mitzvah, that is when you are now responsible. You are a child of the commandments. You know better.
Okay.
12 to 13. Now, granted, we can adjust course. You can have a different view. That's fine, but I'm at least going to walk you through some things. So, Genesis 6, chapter 5, verse 5. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So this, of course, is right after the fall. There's a period of time, and he says all their thoughts are evil continually. So who is he speaking of? Well, it can't be every single. So sometimes people take sweeping statements in the Bible and say it's every single human being, period. But it can't be that because Noah is alive, right? Noah's spirit. So it's not every human not every single human, because Noah walked with God, right? That's the next part of the story. So careful on sweeping statements. Now he's talking about adults that were marrying, because in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 2, we go back and we see that he says, when man began to multiply on the face of the land, daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Now, and also Jesus talks about this in Matthew 24. You don't have to turn there, but he says, for as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. So this seems to be addressing primarily adults overall, or a condition of the adults, not necessarily universal description of like from the time you were born, right? Children don't, a little baby isn't born with evil thoughts continually, right? It's really thinking sleep, milk, and sleep, right? That's kind of where you're at. Maybe crying, but this idea that babies crying is sinful, it's like, well, how else are they supposed to communicate? So that's weird. So now if you go, let's jump into verse 8. He says, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. And Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So how can Noah be blameless and yet corrupted by sin and not have the evil thoughts continually when he said to everyone? Well, the point is that not to take sweeping statements as meaning everyone, right? I think most people know that at this part, right? Like most people are like, okay, everyone but him. Cool, but just be careful then when we're applying that same sweeping statements to everything else in Scripture. Make sense?
What does it mean by blameless? Was he sinless? Or?
So that's a debate. I go back and forth. So now, like the Jews believe that Enoch, for example, was sinless, which is why God swept him up before he did sin. And then, so people, the one thing they don't like about my views, like, so what you're saying is that it's possible someone can go through life without sin, because it means that you're not born with it. And I used to be like, well, no, because we're all fall into it. But then I think that asks the question of possibility versus probability. Like, yeah, okay, sure, it's logically possible, right? It's logically possible you could go through this week without sin. Is it probable? I think that's a different question. Now, with him, with blameless, it could mean that currently he walked with God, or currently he had not sinned and always was faithful to God. I don't have a strong opinion on that one either way. Because if you're blameless, it could also just mean that you will have such a good reputation no one could attack you. Also could mean that you are fully righteous before God. And there are people that are described as righteous before God.
Right.
And so that's a good question, and one that I don't say I have a strong opinion on either way, because I can see it just depends how you interpret certain parts. Does that make sense, Kyle?
Yeah.
I don't know. What are your thoughts? Do you have any thoughts on it off the top of your head?
Um,
Sorry, I reversed the question. I apologize.
no, just calling anyone other than Jesus
Yeah,
sinless
I
is
can't see it being anybody being perfect.
strange.
You know, when they talk about people being
That's fair.
righteous,
Mhm.
they were God seekers, seek to do what God. It doesn't mean you're perfect.
Right. So that's kind of where like the general idea is that you are someone who's faithful to God. You're right. You know.
Faith is credited as righteous.
Right,
So
exactly.
he was
So
the
I'm
only
faithful.
one having faith in God at that
And
time.
being faithful, right? So, yeah, that's an interesting discussion too on faith, because I'm glad you brought that up. Actually, this might help clear it up.
Yeah.
So we look at, when I say faith, hey, you need to have faith in God. You guys probably think intellectual assent, right? Believe in God. But then you also see this part in the Bible of being faithful. And you're like, okay, so that means doing, right? The works. But the word in Greek and Hebrew can be translated as faithful or faithful, depending on context. It's the same word. And it's because the word comes with the connotation of believing and doing at the same time. But the only way we could describe that in our language is something like faithing.
Mhm.
Well, to faith, or to be faithing means that I am both believing and doing. So it's this weird thing. That's why we say that your faith should be shown in your works, right? If you are a believer, you should bear good fruit, right? That's kind of the whole point. You should be sanctified. If not, then you need to start asking yourself, do you have faith? Right? You'll be no.
It's like if Noah had been told by God to build the ark, and he's like, well, I believe in you, God, but not that.
But I ain't gonna build an
Right.
ark. Right, yeah.
It's like, well, would his faith be valid? Would it be a true belief?
Right.
No.
Right, because it just means that you say you believe it, but you're not really willing to back it up and do, right? So that's a good point. So yeah, I will say I lean more toward the whole like belief credited as, but I can also see where the arguments can come from being, no, these people were blameless. Like that's what it says, and we shouldn't try. I can see that. And that's where, in my hesitation, Kyle's the same thing, where I'm like, okay, but well, Jesus. That's where my like I get what you're saying, but
Is that the same blameless as the word described Job, as Job was blameless
Yeah.
man?
mhm. There's quite a few of those Old Testament people that are called that, and it's like it makes you wonder what that would be. And what I should do is I should do a little digging on that and see what I can come up with this week. See what I can find for you. What?
Talk to a Jew.
Yeah, talk to a Jew. I'll talk to one of my Jew people. Sorry, that sounds terrible, but you have to know my friends. I like my friends. It's a different relationship. Man, this goes online. I'm going to get canceled. Brad and Seamus, you guys can vouch. We're cool. By the way, I did want to say this. I've gotten comments on the class channel, and people are very thankful for all of your guys' input, because you guys ask good questions. And like, oh, I really like, I've heard you talk about this on the podcast, but it's really fun to listen to actual class interact. So you guys are doing a good job. So making me look good. And that's hard to do. All right. 2 Peter 2:6 says this. If by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. So what would God make an example of ungodliness if all were ungodly? It doesn't say that they were created wicked. Nowhere does it say that God curses them to be spiritually dead or evil. Again, God says to Cain that sin is crouching at the door, not that he was already sinful. 10 generations between Adam and Noah, not a single reference in the Bible says that they were born sinful or evil or born corrupt, guilty through birth. Instead, we see this idea that they're choosing an evil path. And that is what we see. I mean, read Psalms from this perspective of being able to...
And Kings.
Right.
As well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, when you really get this idea, when you start noticing that, oh, that's the worldview that they're coming from, is that mankind has this flesh now evil desires, the Psalms and James and many other passages start making a lot more sense. Okay, instead of having to like systematize it, you just go, oh, I get it now. So it doesn't say that they were. So again, it doesn't say those things. And then Genesis chapter 6, 12 through 14. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on earth. Now notice, they had corrupted their way. They weren't born that way, corrupted their way. It's something that took place over time. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and out with pitch. So their flesh had corrupted them. Evil desires came through, right? The Yetzer Hara. They were not created corrupt, but they became corrupted, right? So we see that. They had corrupted their ways. So they had rejected the image that they were created in. Does that make sense? Okay. So the earth was filled with violence through them. They caused the violence. Not that they were, again, born that way. So a distinction between Noah and them, though, was that Noah was being of flesh, but he was righteous. And if we read Hebrews, I am more in agreement with this view, right? Which is, he saw their faith and credited unto them as righteousness, right? So, now if we go to Psalm 58:3, go ahead to Psalm 58:3. Go ahead. We're going to hang out in the Psalms for a second, so you may as well turn there. Also, by the way, in that Genesis 6, have you guys ever wondered who in the world were the sons of God that came married the women of flesh? What?
The Nephilim.
Some people think it was the Watchers. And
Yeah, there's all
for
sorts of...
them, like came the Nephilim. And
Yeah. It gets crazy. So there's a multiplicity of views on it, but that would be a fun study.
We're
to
going to
do
get into
sometime.
that because that doesn't make any sense to me.
Keep asking Pastor Ben to go through the book of Enoch in the Bible study.
That's cruel and unusual punishment, Kyle. Go through this really obscure intertestamental book.
Did you?
I got the book of
Well,
Enoch.
it's a crazy read.
I've read all 3 books of Enoch, and it is a trip.
Yeah.
You think Revelation's a trip? You're gonna, Enoch was smoking some wacky tobacco.
I'm very confident it wasn't Enoch who wrote it.
Yeah, probably not. No, I will say this though. So there's actually a really great book on that, or a podcast. How many of you guys are familiar with Dr. Michael Heiser? Okay, yeah, I'm not surprised you got into the nerd world. You're there with me. So if you're Dr. Michael Heiser, someone to look up. He's got a book that actually talks a lot about that. Called The Unseen Realm. It was his first book. It was like this thing that was earth-shattering in the theology world. Okay, but he has a podcast too called The Naked Bible Podcast. In other words, he's revealing it for what it is. So really great. You can look up his website, but he actually will get into the different views. He believes that in what's called the divine council theory, which is that there are more, and I tend to agree with him, that there's more than just, there's God who is the divine being, and there's other divine beings that were created from him, like angels, and that there's a heavenly court. We kind of see some images of that. And he's a real good Old Testament scholar. He'll talk to you about the different views. But essentially, that the sons of God could be a euphemism for rulers of the land. Okay, and there's scholarly work that's been done that can indicate that. Or it could be divine beings that are called the sons of God. That was what they were called as. And then they came in and intermingled with man. And that's where the giants and the Nephilim came from. Okay, so there's Jordan.
Bradley just posted a thing on this in the group. You probably didn't listen to it.
No, I haven't. Because him and
It's really good.
him and Jordan. Not him and Jordan. Him and oh my goodness, Inspiring Philosophy. Michael Jones. Him and Michael Jones talk about that, right?
Yeah.
Him and Dr.
yeah,
Jones.
It's really good.
Yeah, because they both take the idea that the people approach.
That's the thing that's made the most sense to me of anything that I've listened to.
Okay.
I've read Heiser's book.
And,
Okay.
and that's always the thing is like the connection to Enoch isn't really like it's through Jude. Like, well, why would Jude reference Enoch? And it's like, well, maybe it was referencing Enoch, or maybe Enoch is actually trying to steal from Jude, because like the historical basis for the book of Enoch is not nearly as good even as our Old Testament or as the New Testament.
It does kind of show where the first century Jewish mindset was, like in that general intertestamental period. So there's a reason why there's a scholarly debate on it. It's
Yeah,
really interesting.
The thing is, like, our best sources for the book of Enoch are Ethiopian,
Mhm.
and they're post New Testament.
Right.
So it's
So it's like, what is actually happening with there? You
and
know?
then there's other sources too. That's what makes it interesting. I take more of a Heiser position. That's fun. And me and Brad have had that conversation. It was a lot of fun. But anyway, all right. So Psalm 58, verse 3. This is where people will start going to when I'm like, babies aren't born evil. They will start pulling from verses like this. Psalm 58:3. The wicked are estranged from the womb. They go astray from birth, speaking lies. People are like, aha, see, born evil. There you go.
That's not what it says.
But the keen eye might notice it says the wicked are a subset of mankind, not all mankind, and they go astray from the state that they were created in, which is why it says that they go estranged from the womb.
Because
Well, they have to
in the
come
womb you are
from
good.
what?
In the womb you are good.
Right. Well, so that's why I say estranged from.
Right.
There's this when I talk to people, I'm like, well, of course they go astray from the womb. They have to come from somewhere, right? That's kind of my joke on that, where it's like, where else are the children going to come from? They go estranged from the womb, but also it could be argued that the righteous go on the right path from the womb. You know, and we see similar statements. In fact, read Job and notice how many times he references being him in the womb. He talks about the day he wished he was never born, but he also says, like, I kept these commandments from the day of of being in my mother's womb. So it's like there's all these things where you're like, this is Hebraic idiomatic speech. Okay, so in other words, it's Hebrew poetic speech of saying a very long time. Okay, it's a poetic reference. Okay, so, and we have our own hyperboles that we use. So going astray means that they weren't already astray to sin, like speaking lies, right? And because if you read through some of those Psalms too, they kind of clarify their own context, which is interesting. Psalm 22, if you want to turn there. Yeah, sorry, you're going to be turning a lot. But keep your finger in Psalm 58. I probably told you that too late. All right. Psalm 22, 9 through 10. He says, in verse 9, Psalm 22, 9, "Yet you are he who took me from the womb. You made me trust you at my mother's breast. On you was I cast from my birth, and from my mother's womb you have been my God." So which one is it? You see the problem here? One is like from the womb, all positive. The other one, from the womb, negative. It's because it's Hebrew speech. Okay, this is just like idiomatic hyperbole, poetic speech.
One could argue one was elect or not then.
Yes.
I'm not trying to,
You're not trolling?
I'm not trolling, I'm being,
I have a hard time, but no, I'm just kidding. No, so, but that's actually, here's the
That
thing
would
with
be
the elect.
counter.
Calvinism, that 5 points of tulip, the whole thing of elect, is actually logically consistent within itself. That's why I always say it's not you can make it work. The problem is definitions.
Well, and also conformance to Scripture, but
I mean, I would agree, but they would say they're conforming too. But and also the metaphysics thing. But when you have to define elect. Actually, the book of Enoch is very helpful on defining elect. So anyway, we see here that David was not wicked from birth. From the womb, God was also his God. So that's not, that would be considered a good thing. So, odd. Now go back to Psalm 58. Like I said, keep your thumb there, I apologize. Because in that same psalm where he says the wicked go straight from the womb, if you go to verse 10, so Psalm 58:10, he says this: "The righteous will rejoice when he sees vengeance. He will bathe his feet in the blood of the wicked. Mankind will say, surely there is a reward for the righteous. Surely there is a God who judges on earth." So we see a parallelism. This is a normal thing in Hebrew poetry. It's called, parallelisms is where they contrast ideas with each other. So he goes, the wicked, the righteous, the wicked, the righteous. You see, it's a parallel. Do you see how that works in their poetry? They ebb and flow ideas. If you read the Song of Solomon, for example, that book is filled with parallelisms continually all throughout, which is actually why a lot of people find it very confusing when they're reading it, trying to figure it out. It's because they're not seeing the parallelisms, because guess what? English poetry is not the same as Hebrew poetry.
No.
Theirs is usually a concept of ideas with a certain rhythm to it. Ours, of course, we have rhythm, right? A certain rhythm to our poems usually, but they rhyme. And they might explore similar concepts, but not the same. Okay? Does it make sense? Am I making sense a little bit? It's not a complete hermeneutics class, but it's helpful to know. And then if you go to Psalm 71, 5 through 6. Psalm 71, 5 through 6. And this is, I actually don't have that in my, crud. I didn't copy and paste it. I just have the reference in here. So now I got to turn there. Wait for it. Wait for it. Of course, it's Psalm, so it's like you have to scroll continually. I know everyone's waiting for me. I should just ask one of you guys to read it. It says, "For you, O Lord, are my hope, my trust, O Lord, from my youth." Well, that's weird, right? "Upon you I have leaned from before my birth. Upon you I have leaned from before my birth. Sorry. You are he who took me from my mother's womb. My praise is continually of you." So the problem is when we read this and we read that part from the wicked are estranged from the womb, and we're like, see, boom, born evil. Well, but then what do we do with this? You see the problem where it becomes, okay, so we're going to take one super literally, and then the other one we're going to take figuratively. This one we're going to take super literally, this one's all hyperbole. Or how about this? They're both speaking poetically about simple truths. Seems a lot more reasonable. Am I crazy here? What are you guys' thoughts? Are you guys picking up what I'm throwing down a little bit? Okay. If nothing else, maybe it's challenging you where you go, maybe it's not as cut and dry as I thought. Maybe you still believe Augustinian originals and cool, but at least you can acknowledge that people like me, people like Jordan, aren't crazy. Sorry, I'm bringing you into this because you know.
Can I write on your board for a minute? And
Yeah.
talk about something when you're done?
Sure. I'm about ready, actually. Before I jump into Ezekiel 18, how about you go ahead and
I'll
do
tie this back into what we talked about the last couple times.
Yeah, spin
You
it.
weren't, yeah. I'll just write back here for a second while you finish.
He's good. Okay.
I don't know how you're gonna write it upside down. Oh.
Oh.
Well, you get spin. You get to spin on the wheels. So Ezekiel 18, turn there while you're at it. While we're waiting, we'll just turn there.
So we ignore the fact that when the earth was flooded, hundreds of thousands of babies were killed during that period too.
I don't recall ever saying we ignore it.
Well,
No one ever talks about it?
it's part of this baby's innocent or
Mm-hmm. Yep. We've addressed that in other classes, though. So the idea of a judgment is not necessarily that not other people are impacted by it, but when you consider the fact that the people who were living at the time were raping, pillaging, and killing, and murdering, and doing all sorts of horrible things, there's also the fact that God can flood, sure, but also he can call those children unto himself while condemning the wicked. So there's the apologetic of taking care of the aspect there. I'm going to take care of these children's souls. Because in the ancient Hebrew mindset also, the death penalty we look at as a horrible penalty, but they also believed it was preventing someone from further offense. So there's also that side of things where God's calling children up back unto himself to prevent further offense. Like, okay, yes, wipe it out, but now those children are unto me, and now I don't have to, they're not going to be murdered, raped, or be a rapist and a murderer.
The same could be said of cities under the ban when Joshua was conquering when
Right.
he was ordered to destroy every single thing in that.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Does that mean every adult was wicked? Well, I guess, yeah, because Noah was the only one who
Right. Yeah, so
followed God.
those
So
were-
there was nobody
Well,
else
he had a wife and
followed God,
And
other
keep-
than his family.
And keep in mind, when I'm saying that children are born innocent without sin, like, I'm not saying that they are born righteous. Many people misunderstand this. Born innocent is different than born righteous. Does that make sense? Because
Yeah.
righteous means that you got it all good. You're all got it figured out. Being born innocent means you're not guilty of any crime yet. You're a blank slate as far as legally speaking. Which is why it's better. Which is why it says in Deuteronomy 139, "Your children who do not know good from evil." Right? And that's a very important thing. And also, if you read the earliest church fathers before Augustine, you get a little bit with a couple of them, this kind of vein starts setting in, but most of them are talking about that, like, you have to choose this. People choose wickedness. And they all make it very clear that people are not born that way. And they say, actually, again, those who say you are born that way by nature are false teachers. And that's the earliest church fathers, the ones that were even like Polycarp and those who were like Paul, like John's disciples and all of them, like that close to the apostles. They're like, whoo! So I'm just going to say, if I'm going to like flip a coin and take my gamble, I'm going to take their word over these ones 400 years removed. Does that make sense? So are you drawing like Mona Lisa back there? Or?
in a minute.
All right, real quick. Okay, we'll have to talk about this a little bit more in depth next week, I think. We'll jump right here. But Ezekiel 18:20. Ezekiel 18 is a great passage that debunks, I think, Augustine's view of original sin and generational guilt. He says in verse 20, "The soul who sins shall die." So you who are guilty. "The son shall not suffer for the iniquity of the father, nor the father suffer for the iniquity of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself." Well, if you are born with Adam's sin and guilt, that doesn't make sense. Make sense? You see what I'm saying here? Doesn't make sense. And also, people misunderstand the parts in the Torah where it says, God, you are a righteous God. You will not bring your wrath upon us, upon the third and fourth generation. People are like, see right there, generational sin. But even if you read Hebrew commentaries, if you read a lot of what the early church and everyone says, it's talk about that you will not make the generation suffer by punishing the third and fourth generation for the deeds of the father. You're a merciful God. So you have to understand the Hebrew idiom there. We can get into that more next week. You want to turn it?
Yeah, all right, so let me
Do
kind
your
of tie
thing.
what you're saying together to
Cool.
explain Augustinian original sin to what I talked about a few weeks ago.
Oh, that's a good thing to do. Yeah,
All
do
right,
that.
so who in this class remembers this last summer when you drove down 131, there was a billboard for a divorce lawyer. Do you guys remember seeing that? So if you didn't see it, in the bottom right-hand corner was the lawyer's name and his phone number. And I think it said divorce attorney or attorney at law, right? And then it had a picture of a woman's face, right? And she kind of looked troubled. And it only had 3 words on it that like just got the message across. You deserve better. Right?
Sounds like America to me.
So what we talked about a couple weeks ago, so what Will is talking about, anthropology is the doctrine of man. Ontology is the doctrine of being. So, people are made in the image of God. We agree with that?
Mm-hmm.
People made in the image of God have intrinsic worth and value.
Mm-hmm.
So your idea has merit. We're saying that merit is value because your idea has value, right? So when Augustine looked at Romans 9 and it said, Jacob have I loved and Esau have I hated, the problem he saw was that if people made in the image of God have intrinsic worth and value, then God should love everyone. Therefore, the image of God has to be erased, because if you're made in the image of God with intrinsic worth and value, then God will give you the gift of faith. So you either have to say that the image of God is erased because of Adam's sin. Otherwise, you have intrinsic worth and value, and God will give you the gift of faith, because in Ephesians 2:8, Augustine believed that faith was a gift. So that's why, where we talked about the gift of faith brings regeneration. And this is what's called an ontological change. It's a change in your being. And God has to give you that gift and cause an ontological change within you, regenerate you. Arminius called it illumination. So I forget exactly what Augustine called it, but it was that when you were dunked, when you were baptized, it washed away the stain of original sin. That's why if you're Roman Catholic, you still have to go through confirmation. So when you're an infant, you're baptized to wash away the stain of original sin. That way, if you die between baptism and confirmation, you'll still go to heaven. But if you don't go through confirmation, now you're lost. Because all that infant baptism does is wash away the stain of original sin. Okay? So this is why the gift of faith brings regeneration, and then regeneration precedes faith, was because the anthropology of Augustinian original sin meant that your nature of being was incapable because of total depravity, which really means that the image of God is erased in you, because if you have the image of God, then you have intrinsic worth and value, and God would give you the gift. He would give the gift of faith to everyone.
He would save you, right?
So do you kind of, hopefully this helps you tie together how Augustine's view, this Jacob have I loved and Esau have I hated, he's reading that in Romans 9, and he's seeing, well, people have to not have intrinsic worth and value, because he's the one that started saying people don't merit grace. There's no verse in the New Testament that says people don't merit grace. But he started using the word merit because of Romans 9. So that's where his view of man comes from, this view of total depravity, that you don't deserve the love of God. And if you're following this, how this ties together, that Romans 9 is not saying that you don't have intrinsic worth and value, and you are saying that people do deserve the unconditional love of God. But then we go to church on Sunday morning and we sing, the overwhelming love of God. I couldn't earn it. I don't deserve it. But even the pagans, the divorce lawyer, knows the billboard that says, you deserve better. Because we all know that this is really what is true. So the problem for Augustine was this Romans 9. He misunderstood
Yeah.
what Paul was doing with this Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. That's why his anthropology is screwed up. That's why the ontology is screwed up. And there has to be an ontological change where God has to regenerate you, or God has to illuminate you, or God
Give you
has
special
to
knowledge.
do something, right? God has to give you, whatever you call that. But the problem then is the reason most people go to hell is because God is holding out on giving you the gift of faith. That's why the majority of people go to hell. And that's why, if you read Calvin, he says, the glory of God is most men damned to hell. Well, God damns most men to hell to bring glory to himself. That's the reason he reprobates them. It's to damn them to hell, to show forth his justice, to bring glory to himself.
Even though so greater love has no man than he who gives his life for his friends, right? So it seems like it's just causes.
Yeah, so then it's Jesus only prayed for his friend. You know?
What was
Yeah.
that whole Jacob Esau thing? Was that just a bad understanding, or was there a translation problem there?
It was a bad understanding.
It's a
Yep.
fault in logic.
That was actually.
The way we view the word hate and the
yeah.
way they
It
understood
was
it are
just-
different.
Well, also, actually, add Rome. I'm going to add Romans 9 to the other side of the board because we should talk about
So at
that.
some point, somebody's going to have to go through it.
Yeah, we're going to have to just talk about Romans 9. So the other thing is I met with an Orthodox priest this last week. I set up at Holy Trinity Orthodox Church uptown. I reached out. I was like, hey, I'd love to sit down, have a meeting, just ask you some questions because I don't know if you guys have noticed anything, but in the theology world, Protestants and Catholics fight like cats and dogs, and they have all these platforms that they talk. There's one particular group that you never hear from.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the Greek Orthodox. They're just over there doing their thing. Like a mad respect for that, by the way. They're just like, oh, they're fun. We're gonna just go worship God. Let them have at it. So I met with him just for kicks and gigs, essentially, and he's like, oh, you should read this book. I was like, okay, cool. But he described it as this because I mentioned Augustine's. I was like, you guys reject Augustine's view of original sin, don't you? And he's like, he's a saint of our church. He's like, but saints are not infallible. I was like, oh, that's. So they reject. I was like, wow, that's different from Catholics who believe in the magisterium. And he goes, but he's like, just because they don't inherit guilt does not mean that there's not something broken inside. And I was like, that is accurate. And because that's Jordan and I will put it in a fancier way. I stole it from you, but mankind is born with a fallen moral rectitude. In other words, we're not born with a perfect moral compass. Okay, so that's why you see kids at a young age do bad things, but also good things. But you have to teach your child, right? No, you don't do that. Why? My daughter has no idea when she took a toy that's called selfishness. She just goes, I want the toy. Give it back to me. So just these are things that you have to teach to your child. So real quick, before, and I'm going to add Romans 9 up here. And I'm going to erase this one. We're going to get rid of that one. Because that's just too much. This will probably be pretty simple. Jordan, you and I could probably tag team that one. So what I was going to ask you guys to do, because we're about
10 minutes.
Yeah, we're over. But we're nearing the end of the Doctrine of Man because I'm going to tie it all together. So what I'd like you guys to do is vote on what the next series you want to go through. New Testament defense, defending it historically there's a better approach than what I even went over with you guys before. There's a way better approach, but I gave you guys an overview approach. The doctrine of hell, comparing views. Case law of the Old Testament, like even Old Testament genocide, alleged genocide. And Romans 9. What is the next series you want to do? This one would tie into this very well. So with this one, if you want to continue that, but if there's something you really want to know, let me know. Just vote up there with a tally mark. Okay? Thanks. Helps me start guiding my thoughts in my future. This is easier than me trying to decide.